You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. I'm a really big believer in the idea of RevOps as a function supporting all the go-to-market teams. Marketing, sales, customer success, quite often partner ops or data ops too. This belief is one of the reasons for the name of this show, and it's really why I try to take a broad view across the entire go-to-market function in terms of the episodes and the guests that we have. But I'll be honest, sometimes it's a little discouraging when I look at how RevOps is done in practice and when I look at job descriptions for RevOps leaders, because outside of a few examples, I usually see essentially a sales ops function with a new name. So I posted on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, thinking out loud and asking, who's actually leading a unified RevOps team in the real world? Where are all these people and how are they doing it and how's it working out for them? And lo and behold, I got connected with a bunch of really smart folks who you'll be hearing from in the weeks and months ahead. And first on that list is Julia Kim, VP of Revenue Operations at Electric, where she leads a unified RevOps team. Julia's been an operations executive for over 10 years now and is also an adjunct professor at Columbia University. She's got a ton of good stuff to share with us. Very excited to chat with you today, Julia.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be here because I absolutely know what you're talking about. It is a challenge. I think a lot of people think of RevOps as a sales ops function, but you're missing out on so many of the benefits of revenue operations if you think in sort of that silo. And so I'm really glad we're going to be able to talk about that today.
Amazing. So maybe let's start there with revenue operations. How do you think of it if you had to put it in a nutshell? What's the scope and what is the mandate of RevOps?
So here at Electric, it really is very cross-functional and very much focused on the go-to-market teams and motion. So if you think about what teams typically are included in a go-to-market, kind of scope, it would be sales, marketing, customer success, partnerships or business development, a little bit of finance thrown in, but lots of different opportunities to collaborate when it comes to generating revenue, whether it's through new business, net new, or retention through existing customers, and then utilizing your relationship with those customers to grow revenue. And so when I think about revenue operations, I really think about it in the context of all of those teams, and then also thinking about it from the perspective of data. What data do we have? How are we collecting that data? How are we storing that data? How are we reporting on that data? The process in terms of what's different between a marketing process that may be top of funnel versus a customer success workflow and retention. And then also thinking about it from a tech stack perspective, because one of the biggest drivers and one of the things I leverage all the time is technology, because that is a multiplier for you. A lot of times RevOps teams don't get a ton of support internally. Fortunately for me here at Electric, there's a ton of support for RevOps, but in many organizations, you don't get a lot of the support that you need in the form of resources or people. And so what do? You can absolutely use technology to help multiply all of those benefits that you would get from a unified RevOps team.
I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/Knack, that's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners. One of the things that I think about a lot is where does the responsibility of the function itself and where does RevOps begin? I mean, there's certain things like technology is an area where it's usually quite unambiguous. And then I find that there are sometimes gray areas where it's the partnership, there's some push and pull. How do you think about that? Like, where do people say, we need to bring ops in for this sort of problem, in your view?
It really depends on where you are in the spectrum of maturity for your organization. And I think this is a piece that is sometimes missed because I think a lot of times people just kind of have a blanket approach to how they balance that ratio of operational tactical thing and strategy. And so when I first came to Electric, I was actually actively recruited to join to fix RevOps there. there was a lot that was going on. They were more on the immature side when it came to the operations and tactical pieces. And so when you think about an organization that's in that state, you really have to think about what is going to benefit the organization the most. And it's usually the more operational processes, less on the strategy. It's the doing and getting things done and kind of cleaning things up and right-sizing things. And so if you're in an organization where you're sort of on that immature side of that spectrum, you're spending a lot more time doing, less time on the responsibility of coming up with the strategy and the direction. However, as the organization matures, and this is where Electric is today, we're fairly mature on the operational. And that's where RevOps has come in more recently to be much more strategic. So one of the things that I try to align at every stage of growth within a RevOps organization is your org design. So if you think about your org design, it's who are the people that are on your RevOps team? At Electric, it's a standalone team. Some organizations, RevOps as a function is embedded within the different go-to-market teams. So there might be an ops person on marketing, an ops person on sales, but at Electric, everything is centralized into a central team. And that's actually worked out really well. And when I first started, it was more focus on the operational aspects so we could get all the things done, build those processes, get the data in the systems, be able to report on how we're doing and what's happening in the systems and the processes that we have. But as we became more mature, the strategy piece became a larger and larger component of what RevOps is. And so as part of that, I actually added a new team within RevOps called Revenue Programs. And essentially what Revenue Programs does is it is very much forward thinking. They are thinking about piloting, testing out those operational processes at a very small scale, sometimes manually, sometimes with light technology or light automation, just to make sure that one, we're seeing the outcomes that we want, that we kind of work out all those kinks that, can exist in any process, because anyone can come up with a process, but does it actually work, right? You don't know sometimes until you actually roll it out. And the mistake, and for a lot of organizations, I think, is when you roll something out with the expectation that it's just going to work perfectly on day one. And that's not the case. I think if you are an organization like Electric, where you're a startup, you need to move quickly. Things are shifting constantly. You really do need to take a more iterative and agile approach. And so Revenue Programs is actually a new, what I call a pod. So we have a sales ops pod, a marketing ops pod, a CX pod. Partnerships and business development actually falls under the sales ops pod. We also have a tech ops pod that supports all of the tech stack that we have. But we now also have a revenue programs pod because that is where we do a lot of our experimentation and say, does it make sense to, roll out this type of payment plan? Does it make sense for us to have the CSMs own this part of, the process? And it's been really great because as we shift and continue to grow, I think strategy is going to be a larger and larger part of what RevOps does. But for many organizations where you're sort of in the earlier stages, it's probably not feasible to be as strategic or own a lot of that directionality you're talking about because there's just too many things on fire.
There's kind of a hierarchy of needs almost, if we think about it that way.
Absolutely.
If you can't run an email campaign, then you're not necessarily going to be thinking deeply about strategy until you have those fundamentals in place.
Yes, people are like, well, what's the value of revenue operations if they can't even get it, in your example, right, an email campaign, standardize and have it deliver in terms of click-through rates or things like that. And so again, it's really focusing on where can you provide the most value? And once you hit those points, that's when you have to really think about, okay, well, how can I shift more to that strategy so we're not in a place where we're being reactive? Because I think a lot of RevOps teams are very reactive. And so how do you shift from being very reactive to being more proactive? It's also part of that maturity, right? Because when you're strategic, you can almost put those processes in place to help you be more strategic, but you can't get there without kind of cleaning house and making sure your own house is in order.
I'm fascinated by the structure of your team. And so I want to just pull those different pods apart a bit that you described. Maybe we'll just start with the tech pod because perhaps it's the easiest for everyone to understand, but sounds to me like kind of almost like a business systems function embedded within your team, runs the technology. Is that an accurate way of thinking about it?
Yes, absolutely. They are responsible primarily for our CRM system. We use Salesforce at Electric, and a lot of what they do is day to day in terms of ticket management, because obviously there are many issues that might come up, or, people want different fields or different functions. They're also responsible for things like tech debt. With any systems, you often have things that you really need to think about cleaning up in order to kind of maintain the system. And then also strategy in terms of how can we expand the use of our systems in order to make it better. So one great example is we use Salesforce primarily for Sales Cloud and Service Cloud. We also have Salesforce CPQ and billing. But is what we have in place good enough or supporting the partnerships and business development we're trying to accomplish? Right now, we're okay, but I think we'll soon get to a point, because of the partnerships that we have, because of the partner ecosystem we have, that we will likely need to think about, are there more ways that we can leverage Salesforce or some other tool that maybe integrates with Salesforce to better enable both internal folks and also external partners, right? And so really thinking about that and starting to do discovery around that, and really having a milestone in place that says, when partnerships looks like this might be a good time for us to kind of pull the trigger and start really being serious about this. But that's where TechOps has been, an amazing partner for many of these go-to-market teams, because it's not just about making sure that the systems are running, but it's also thinking strategically about what are their needs in the future.
And are they running all the technology that the go-to-market teams use, or are there, like, let's say your marketing automation system, or maybe even smaller tools with a narrower scope? Are those run by some of the other pods directly?
So it used to be that a lot of those tools were actually centralized in TechOps. But again, part of this maturity model that I'm talking about, you sometimes get to a point where you need to really dig deeper into the tools that you have. And at that point, you need someone who's almost a subject matter expert in that tool. So it's not just about administering the tool, like adding users or removing users or turning on features. It's almost thinking about what are we not using, or what are we using that we could use better? And so now the shift has actually been exactly what you're saying. We are now moving a lot of these core systems, for example, like our marketing automation platform, which is Marketo, or our customer engagement platform, which is Gainsight. We're moving them now into the ops manager's domain, because they're likely to have much better insight in how we can leverage those tools. They can build those relationships with our vendors. And so it's really about figuring out how can we dig even deeper. And I think this also aligns with what a lot of companies are doing. The economy is not that great. And so a lot of RevOps teams are being asked to, be strategic, do some tech consolidation, seeing how they can reduce expenses, right? And so part of that for us at Electric has been, how can I have my team almost say, is this really a tool, or is there another tool that we're using that has the same exact features, but we can incorporate at a lower cost, or maybe it's already included in our contract? A great example is a chat feature. We had actually 3 different tools that had chat. And one of the nice things about Marketo was that they talked about this AI-driven dynamic chat feature that they rolled out last year. And we were clearly not leveraging because we were using 2 other chat, platforms. And so that's a great opportunity for us to say, okay, well, let's not pay for these other 2 tools. Let's consolidate in a tool we have, Marketo, leverage the AI features that they're saying are fantastic, and really make that experience for our prospects even better than they were before. And so I think that's a strategy that anyone can take, especially at a time like this when a lot of finance teams are saying, hey, we're spending a lot on these tools. What can we do?
And what you just described, in a way, to me, it highlights some of the benefits ostensibly that we should gain from RevOps, and that we don't have these silos where, like, sales ops has a tool and marketing ops has a tool, that the teams actually can look at things holistically together. And I'm curious, how do those different, like, you've got your marketing ops pod, your sales ops pod, and your CX pod, aside from the fact that they all roll up to you, how do they collaborate together on like a day-to-day basis to make these sorts of decisions?
Yeah, there's a few different ways that I've built collaboration into our team. It really starts with just us being humans and getting to know each other and enjoying the day-to-day and working with each other. So I do a lot with my team to really build up our personal relationship, because if you don't enjoy working with them and we're at work for many hours a day, that's a problem. And so we've built, one, a really strong team of high performers. And then two, we have a lot of activities where we're maybe not talking about RevOps, but we're getting to know each other. We're solving problems together. We're having fun together. We have a weekly meeting on Friday afternoons called Weekly Wins. It started out with the whole, what was a win that I had from a professional perspective, to what did I have as a personal win? But what we found was we knew so much about what was happening week over week. That wasn't really that engaging. And so we actually now have it essentially a half-hour game time together. And so we break up into teams. We have different formations. We are competitive. We solve problems. And so all of those things are ways that aren't focused on our day-to-day, but we're still getting to know each other, build culture, and then learn to solve problems together. On the flip side, when it comes to projects and visibility, we have a weekly team stand on Tuesday mornings where we go through high priority projects. People kind of flag different things that they're talking about. We also have systems in place to help us, because as much as we all want to be creatures of habit, there's a lot of things that are often being thrown at RevOps teams. So having systems in place to help collaborate. So we're very active on Slack. We have dedicated internal Slack channels for different things. We use the Atlassian suite. So we use Confluence for documentation. That is so important to us. I was looking at just the sheer number of documents that we created in the last 6 months, and it's over 150 pages that we created, which is incredible. The more information that you're sharing, the better, not just for us internally, but for the entire organization. And then we use Jira as another tool, again, to help with collaboration. So the way that every day starts is that we actually have a 9 a.m. Jira stand where we go through all the tickets that came through together as a team. It's really quick. On average, it's about 7-10 minutes, but we allocate about 15 minutes every morning. So we're going through things that are high priority, any incidents that come through, and then we're leaving most of the day to work on different projects. And between the weekly team stand touch point and then just the constant communication that happens on Slack and usage of Jira, we are in pretty good communication and fairly aware of what's happening, from marketing all the way to customer success. The one thing that I have been consciously doing from an internal perspective to even broaden our understanding, because one of the things that Electric has been doing in the last 6 months is shifting from a sales-led organization to a much more product-led organization. So the emphasis is much more on the product, is really educating everyone on what that means and bringing in engineering, bringing in product into those conversations and really trying to break down those silos. That has been one of the things that we've been actively working with all of the teams around. And I think we've been able to make this transition into a more product-led organization. We have a ways to go because we revamped our product in November and relaunched it, and that's newer. And so there's still a lot of growth there, but there's a ton of collaboration, a ton of communication, not just within RevOps, but outside of RevOps, that is also feeding back within the team itself. So it's really about building all of that communication and collaboration at many different levels so that there isn't one thing that's solving the problem, but it's all these little things that are contributing to a much more smooth and standardized, and I would say even consistent process.
My friend Paul Wilson has a phrase that's really stuck with me about teams that run the business and then other teams that change the business, and how you kind of need both. Is that how you think about it as well? Like the programs team is really there to come in and like disrupt business as usual and figure out better ways of doing things?
Absolutely. A great example is that with our new product, you can actually buy resold software, you can buy services from us, you can buy hardware like a new computer and bundle it with a monitor and all kinds of things. And so the question was, where does it live in terms of hey, we want to experiment with a flexible payment plan. Where does that live? Does that live in product? Does that live in engineering? Does that live in finance? Does that live with the customer success team? Like, where does that live? And I think a lot of companies struggle with that question. And so you end up wasting a lot of time trying to find a right home, or someone says, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to lead this project, but they don't have the right support. They don't have the right resources. They don't have the right access. And so the project just stalls for a period of time. And then people are like, what happened to that project? I thought we were going to do flexible payment. And so that revenue programs pod essentially answers that question. It's not that they have full ownership of all the aspects of flexible payments in this example I'm sharing with you, but they have the ability to bring in the right people at the right time. They have the ability to project manage that project and essentially put some stakes in the ground saying, hey, let's do discovery and see what comes out of this. Let's see what we can push out as an initial product offering. What does it mean from a legal perspective? Let me go back to sales ops and see how that looks within that process. Or let me go to the procurement team and let me understand what that looks like. So it provides those really important initiatives a home, but maybe not ownership, because at the end of the day, there's probably a different team that needs to own that. Maybe it's finance, maybe it's product. I'm not sure, but it allows us to still move forward and maybe get to the point where the end owner is obvious. And not only that, but we have some real data about what happened. We put a social post up and people actually click the button and raise their hand and say, I'm interested. But I think it provides us an ability to move forward without all the pieces in place, because I think that's the biggest killer for a lot of startups, right? You have this assumption you need every single thing in place in order for us to be successful. And that's not true. You can essentially build the train as you're running down the track. And so that's really the value that I see in a pod or structure like revenue programs.
I think it's a pillar that a lot of teams are missing or haven't identified, or other people do it ad hoc, and it creates some tension because you're like, oh, I got to focus on, all these business as usual things and keeping the trains running on time. And then when do I have time to focus on those other things? So I find it really interesting that you split that out. There are a lot of folks out there who have concerns about bringing the teams together, whether it's that, a unified function won't be as responsive to the needs of the functions they serve as they would be if they were embedded within it, or that, there can be power disparities. Like, I know a lot of marketing ops functions, frankly, are afraid of just being like swallowed up by a bigger sales ops fish and being run by a sales ops leader that doesn't understand marketing. I spoke to a CS ops leader who said that there are similar concerns there. So have you seen those challenges, I guess, would be the first question, and how did you address them, if so?
Yes, they exist, but I work really hard to try to reduce those impacts. And it's really at, again, many different levels. Number one is that the org structure makes a lot of difference. And so having a similar structure between the different operational pods is very important. So for example, the sales ops pod has a ops manager and an analyst, and there's an enablement person. CX ops has ops manager, analyst, enablement. They essentially have a dedicated tech ops person that they can go to, someone who's stronger on the sales cloud side, someone who's stronger on the service cloud side. So there's a sort of a mirroring of the org structure that provides just a organizational harmony or equality in those teams. But of course, you have teams like marketing, which tends to be smaller, right? Marketing tends to be smaller than a sales team or a CX team or a CS team. And so that's the case here at Electric. The marketing pod is quite small. It's one individual right now. We have a marketing ops manager, but they can leverage time and work and resources from either the sales ops or CX ops pods. So there's ability to leverage resources from different pods. And not only that, but again, thinking about how to make that fear go away. There isn't a clear answer for this, but I think the biggest thing is just try it and see if it works. because at Electric, they actually had the ops teams embedded within the different go-to-market teams. It didn't work at all. It failed miserably. And so they were very open to a different type of structure. There was really nothing to lose. And the benefit there was that we actually were able to get a ton more productivity. And then you got things like collaboration between marketing ops and sales ops. I think traditionally marketing and sales and marketing ops and sales ops, as you were saying, can be a little bit of a conflict. But because we're under one single umbrella, because we're doing the work to work together, be humans, know that we are all trying to get to that end goal of generating revenue and retaining revenue for our company, we work really well together. And I think it does take the right type of organizational structure and leader. Just because you bring everyone together doesn't mean that it's going to work. And again, I've been very thoughtful in hiring for the team because we want to make sure that everyone is able to have those hard conversations. Sometimes there are problems, and it's not that you're the problem or they're the problem or someone caused that problem. There is a problem. And so some wild investigation to figure out what happened, really our time is better spent on solving that problem and figuring out how do we move on from here. And so having those individuals on the team that have that type of mentality is so important. I specifically have been trying to make sure that our culture supports an environment where things are going to not work. Things are going to fail. People may get upset. But the most important thing is how do we identify a solution and how do we move forward? Because if we can, then we're all winning, right?
I think that is 100% the most healthy attitude. And last quick org structure question. I'm just curious, who do you report into?
Yeah, I currently report into our CRO. When I first started, we had a senior VP of sales and I reported into that senior VP of sales. And at some point I had reported into finance. But I think this particular structure, and I was actually talking about this with someone over the weekend, is the most optimal. Because we've actually renamed our go-to-market teams from go-to-market teams to revenue teams. Partnerships actually wasn't originally underneath revenue. It was actually underneath product. And so that shift in thinking about go-to-market and thinking about it from a revenue perspective made us very quickly realize that, you know what, partnerships actually belongs under revenue. It is generating revenue. And so more recently, partnerships in the last few months has moved underneath the revenue teams. And everything kind of revolves around this idea of, are we doing the best we can from a revenue perspective? And not to lose sight of the customer. How do you generate revenue? It's through your customer. So at the end of the day, if you actually drill down, it always ends at the customer. And so having RevOps report into our CRO has been fantastic because we have been able to, one, really bring together all the revenue teams, have revenue as a clear line of sight, build our OKRs around that, but then also, again, how do we generate revenue? Through our customers. And so not lose sight of our customers.
Big thanks goes out to UserGems for sponsoring today's episode. We all know that outbound is tough. You dial and you email and you get the door slammed in your face by people who don't know who you are. Now imagine a world where you're reaching people who know your product, love your product, and are actually happy to hear from you. UserGems makes that a reality. They identify your customers and champions who change jobs and automatically push new contacts into your CRM so your team can follow up. Their outreach playbooks make it dead simple to get started, and their team is amazing. If you're not reaching out to customer job changers, you're missing opportunities. Head on over to revops.fm/usergems for a special offer just for my listeners. It's a good launching off point for the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is how do you identify where you're going to have the most impact? And it seems like a simple question in a lot of ways, but 100%, let's say, revenue operations teams have way more on their plate than they can handle, besieged by requests. And so it's a really important capability to have that discernment, to have good judgment about what you take on. So how do you think about that problem, about like where your team can make the biggest impact?
So it is a little easier because we use OKRs. And so what that means is that right now for 2024, our top 3 are one called Fund the Future, second called Efficient Funnel, and third is MVP, is basically Most Valuable Partner. So short of those things and allocating some time for important things like dealing with tech debt or just system critical thing, that essentially very much aligns our priority, because there is a distribution in the work that we do for each of these OKRs. So the majority of it being on the efficient funnel side, obviously, but not neglecting the MVP OKR or Fund the Future OKR. So we are constantly looking at it from that lens. And not only that, but also having the right tools in place to be able to capture information that you can then leverage to make that case back to the business. And the reason why I say this is because when I first came to Electric, there wasn't really a ticket tracking system. There was a little bit of Asana here and there, some Excel, but it really was a free-for-all. I think people were just like, hey, this thing needs to be done. And people are like, okay, yes, I'll do it. And that's a terrible way to function. And so you're absolutely right. People get frustrated. Like, why did you do this? And why didn't you do this? Or I need this. And what do you mean it's going to take you 3 weeks? Because it doesn't seem like you're doing anything, right? Number one priority was, one, put some sort of system in place where we could actually track what requests we were getting, have them documented, and sort of use that as a framework for us to evolve from. And so that's how we ended up with Jira. It wasn't perfect, but it was like, let's start with a sprint. Let's see if we can get through 2 sprints. We're, I think, sprint 45 right now, which is fantastic. And we have been able to measure as part of this process how many tickets get submitted every single day, how many of them are high priority, how many of them are low priority or middle, and see how long does it take for us to close tickets, which ones generate other tickets because there's a little too broad. But it's provided us with so much data, and it's been able to provide us with information that says, we need more resourcing on this side because there's a lot of things happening on this side. Or, oh my gosh, it looks like we have a serious enablement issue because all of the tickets that have been coming in for the last 2 weeks have all been questions that, could be solved by enablement rather than a, technical change or, a process change. It's just people just weren't sure what they were doing. And so that system was such a valuable piece, and having the OKRs align with the things that we're doing, we've since evolved, has been instrumental to being able to manage priorities, but we've since evolved since day one when I said, hey, we're going to start using Jira. And there was honestly some pushback. There was concern about how do we maintain something like this? And I'm like, okay, well, let's just try it. But we're now at the point where we actually have bi-weekly sprint planning meetings where we can actually fill out things. We have regular meetings with different stakeholders saying, hey, what do you want in our next sprint? Which gives people so much joy and excitement because they're like, oh, that thing I asked for, can you do it in sprint 46? Yes, absolutely. Or, actually that's going to have to wait until 47 because that's dependent on something that's being done in 46. So having that framework has been so important in being able to balance those priorities. And I think one of the challenges in being in a RevOps org and dealing with the sort of prioritization issues and how to manage that process, having a tool, even though there's overhead in having that tool, is so valuable because it gives you actual data and actual leverage to say, it's not reasonable for you to expect an email to go out after you just sent it to me 30 minutes ago, right? Poor marketing ops manager, right?
You've mentioned tickets and working with your stakeholders. And then we've also talked about strategy, a team that is sort of proactively identifying opportunities to evolve strategy and make impact. This is something that I think about a lot. How do you think about the balance or how to weight taking requests and working with teams to fulfill those requests, in other words, giving GTM teams what they asked for, versus proactively looking yourself at data or at process and saying, I actually think we need to go in this direction. There's these two different motions. They're both important. How do you split your effort between them?
I would say it's probably 60% managing requests at this point and 40% driving a lot of that. Like, hey, did you notice that? What do you think about it? And I think it's going to shift more in the coming year. It's because of where we are. But I want to be clear that for that first 60%, we aren't just taking any ticket and saying, okay, sprint 44, sprint 45, done, check. No. We do really think about, one, how does it impact data that we have existing in the system? How does it impact other systems? Because our go-to-market or RevOps tech stack is highly integrated. We have a ton of integrations, not just to existing vendors, but to our product and our legacy product and many different services that we have to provide from a service delivery perspective. And so really important for us to ask those questions and be sort of the gatekeepers around that. But then also really think about what is the true problem, right? Because we get a lot of requests where they're like, I'm trying to build a report, but I can't get Salesforce to give me this data. Can you add this field? I just need you to add this field so I could build my report, so I could send it to X, Y, and Z. And one of the things that I have been really pushing this year with support from our data, we have a dedicated engineering data team, is really thinking about our CRM as a transactional system and our Snowflake data warehouse as a reporting system. And I think people tend to conflate the two because a lot of times, Salesforce does have some really great reports and dashboards, but we have become more mature as an organization where we want to integrate product data. We want to integrate other sources of data that don't originate or maybe live in Salesforce. And yes, we can absolutely put that stuff in Salesforce, but what is the purpose behind that? How is that going to serve us better? And is that really the true purpose of Salesforce? As much as we call it our system of truth, and that is absolutely true, it can still be our system of truth if it's pushing data into our data warehouse and we're reporting there, right? And so tools like Looker, Tableau, any BI tool that you have, or even any data management tool, they're going to do a much better job of slicing and dicing and visualizing the data that you want than Salesforce, as much as Salesforce tries. They really do try. But the thing that I think we've come to that point in our maturity level is Salesforce needs to be a transactional database. Anything that has to do with transactions lives there. Anything that has to do with data lives in our data warehouse. And so we can do this ticket, but that's not actually what we need to do here. What really needs to happen is, are you able to generate that report in Looker or Tableau or whatever the system is? And if you're not, can I help you communicate with our data team so you can get that information that you need? So it's really kind of thinking about it from that perspective, because as much it is ticket resolution, it's also thinking about things as in terms of what is the true problem? What are we trying to solve?
You've touched on data. What's the relationship between your data team and your team? Because obviously there's a lot of codependency there.
Yes. So we are primarily responsible for anything Salesforce related, Marketo related. And then the data team is fully responsible for our Snowflake data warehouse.
One of the challenges I've found with reporting out of a data warehouse or using that entirely as the system of reporting, and I think a reason why a lot of people just relapse into Salesforce is, even though it's more powerful and ultimately more flexible, there can also be a rigidity. It's like, oh, actually this table doesn't have this. I'm going to have to do a request and there's friction. So I'm just going to create a quick Salesforce report because it's not right, but it's the path of least resistance. How have you thought about that in terms of your relationship with that team and making sure that the reporting environment is going to serve those needs so that you can push people towards that place?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We actually have a data council specifically for that purpose. And the data council is comprised of people from the data team, obviously people from RevOps. There's someone from finance. There's someone from product. There's a lot of different people who are part of that council specifically to talk about those questions and almost get ahead of those things, because a lot of times you have a project that's coming up and it's like, there's probably going to be a data component to this project. So let's make sure that you're aware of it and that we're really thinking about it. The other piece too is that as we've become more rigorous or a little bit more structured from a RevOps internal process perspective, we have been doing more around incorporating UAT or user acceptance testing in our process. And it's been an evolution of incorporating the agile methodology and having sprints and do sprint planning, using Jira to help manage that. For what we consider medium projects, that might be quick user acceptance testing and, pulling in the data team to help with that user acceptance testing by the ops managers before it gets rolled out, or maybe the enablement manager and then it gets rolled out. For larger projects that are maybe 3 months in duration or longer, we actually have dedicated testers, either end users from the business or different people that are a part of that process. And we build enablement as part of that testing process too. And the data team is involved there. So we're trying to build multiple touch points so that any data discrepancies or issues in integrating data are cut early, because we're trying to integrate more of that testing and collaboration and knowledge and understanding of what is coming out of this project earlier in the process.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you touched on user acceptance testing. You've also mentioned enablement, and all that to me speaks to, the importance of change management. It's something that RevOps teams in general maybe don't give as much emphasis as they should in all cases. Honestly, I think it's one of those things like that can make or break, particularly with functions like sales ops or CS ops, where you have to change the behavior sometimes of a large number of users, for your project to be successful. Users who may not necessarily be very interested, like they want to hit their quota, they don't necessarily care about the success or failure of your project intrinsically, unless you can make them care. And so I guess the question is, how do you make them care? When you have a project that you're rolling out to those teams, how do you get their buy-in so that you can succeed?
I am really fortunate that at Electric, the messaging is consistent from the very top levels down. And so when we have all hands meetings every month, it's pretty clear like what we care about. Hey, we have a new partnership. This is a focus for us. Or, hey, this is a channel that's important for us. This is a process that we're excited about. And so it's that messaging makes it easier to then break that down to what is that specific thing, as you were talking about, that an AE cares about that might motivate them. And it could be a financial component, right? It could be a spiff. It could be maybe the way that their comp plan is structured or whatever. Or, for the CSM, maybe it's, I don't want my customer to submit a negative NPS survey or whatnot. But it really is leveraging the clarity that starts and the transparency that starts at the top, and then customizing it and just really understanding who your true end users are internally. But I think it's also a strength of enablement. I think people think of enablement as just training. And I think that's where, again, I have made a conscious effort to differentiate what I think of as enablement. And it actually answers one of the earlier questions you had around, how proactive are you about things? And that's a great area for enablement. When they're past the sort of traditional things you think about from an enablement perspective, like training or putting materials together, that's great and everything. And I'm having my enablement manager leverage our analysts more to kind of get some of that done. The real value of enablement is saying, where are the gaps in productivity? Because it's not just about learning. It's also about productivity from their perspective, from their roles perspective. And so one of the things that my enablement manager and I are actively working on is leveraging her expertise in how people learn, how people ingest information, the different ways that people have to see or feel or engage with things. And knowledge within the tool. So for example, we were just looking at Gong and saying, hey, maybe there's a better way we can expose some of these dashboard widgets and stuff for people that are in there. Or is there a way we can actually kind of pull out some of this information and have it in Salesforce in a better way? We actually have an integration, but in a better way. And so enablement then becomes not just about training, not just about teaching them about like a sales process. It's almost like, yes, okay, that is the basics of what you need to do. But the real value in enablement is for an AE that now understands what the sales process is, how much time are they spending on emails? How much time are they spending on calls? And is that distribution look okay? So if there's someone who's being much more successful in close winning opportunities, and they happen to have maybe a 40-60 ratio of emails to calls being greater, maybe that's a tactic that other people on the team can do. And how great is it that enablement can say, hey, I've been looking at the data, sales director or sales manager, and we've noticed that these 2 people or these 3 people are not quite performing as well, but they're also not doing these other things as well. I think there are some AEs, especially some high performing AEs that have their own kind of method and it works for them. But I think for the most part, many people maybe just aren't doing the things that they need to do. And it's not just this one time, hey, let's train them and get them knowledgeable. It's the lifelong learning process. And so I think that's where the real value of an enablement can be, because they can almost be a productivity coach. And that can be applied across the board. It's not just AEs. It's not just SDRs. It's not just CSMs or AMs. You could almost think about this from a project perspective. Like, are we doing projects in a way that are conducive to collaboration, right? And so that's what we're trying to do with enablement, take it to the next level beyond just training.
I love that example as a case of how ops can really drive impact beyond just, yes, we have a request, we have to partner on those things, but also kind of challenging the business, being somebody who's there, like having a second set of eyes. Are we doing this in the best way? Is this what great looks like? How can we move this forward? That's such an important part that often gets missed. I think because teams often don't have time to do it in full fairness. But having those folks that have that as part of their scope, I think is just so important.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best examples I can think of how enablement helped me really, again, consolidate our tech stack and therefore save money is I asked our enablement manager to do an analysis and look at our sales stages in the pipeline and see what was the level of usage across all of those stages. And of course, some of it makes sense, right? Like in the beginning, they're having a lot of calls with people. So Gong is like high usage, right? And then you can kind of see Salesforce is maybe consistently used, maybe a little bit more when you're negotiating. But that sort of heat map of how different tools were being utilized, the level of usage, the duration of usage, and the sales stages made it so obvious which tools provided the most value consistently across all the sales stages. And then also which ones had sort of like the most impact when. And that's a great example of how if you don't think of enablement as just that training function, that is a huge piece of value, because you want to make sure that if AEs are spending a ton of time in Gong in the beginning, that they really are leveraging the tool within Gong that are going to help them really move those stages to that next stage, right? And so it's really another efficiency approach in aligning your tech stack, the data you have, the people you have, the process you have, using a team like RevOps.
When we think about technology and go-to-market, obviously, the thing that looms over us all right now and for the past year or so has been AI and all the changes that have happened there. I know this is something that you have thought a lot about and have been doing some work there. What are the main use cases that you see where you think there's an opportunity to drive real value with AI and RevOps?
I may be alone in this, but I feel so strongly that AI is one of those things that our RevOps team can absolutely leverage, and it doesn't have to be homegrown. I was just at the Stripe conference last week in San Francisco, and Jensen Huang, who is the CEO of NVIDIA, was a speaker on one of the days of the conference. And he had this really great quote where he talks about first you as an individual. So people are always afraid that they're going to lose their job to AI. And he said, you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to someone who is using AI. So don't worry about the AI. Worry about the person who's leveraging AI. But I think the most impactful statement he said was the second one, which is that your company isn't competing with AI. It's not like your company versus AI, OpenAI, or any of these other, like Microsoft or Google or whatnot. Meta. It's competing with another company that is using AI strategically, right? Because you can do all the operational excellence, tactics, all of that, even strategy. But if you don't have that special sauce of AI, you're not going to win against all the others. And so I thought that was so interesting. And I think this is where, because there's such a technical component to revenue operations, and because there's so many great tools that are spending millions of dollars within the RevOps tech stack, that you can leverage all of those benefits. Oftentimes, these things are already included in your contract. You just don't know about them, or maybe you're not sure. And, you can kind of talk to your rep and say, hey, I don't want to pay an extra, God knows what for this AI feature, but I would love to pilot it out to see what the ROI might be. But such a great opportunity to leverage all the things that are happening and really understand what are your true needs around AI. And then if it is something that you need to customize, you can work with your data team. You can work with your engineering team to build out those very custom models or custom machine learning algorithms that might be specific to your industry. But literally today, you could say, hey, I have Gong. How can I leverage those AI features and get started and be competitive? But the areas that, I really think that AI is going to benefit RevOps is one around predictive AI. A lot of RevOps teams, I am, one of them, have to think about forecasting. What are sales going to look like? What is spend going to look like? Is this customer going to churn? And there are some really great built-in features across, again, all of those tools in our RevOps tech stack that can help you leverage those use cases. But I think, again, predictive AI is such an important area where we can utilize it today and make some contribution to the bottom line for our companies. The other area that's so important is generative AI. And I always think of generative AI not just about content creation, but really around productivity, right? So it's, if you have outreach, use those Gen AI tools in order to, generate those email follow-ups. Use those call summaries and other action item features that are built into, again, the tools that you have in your tech stack. For the most part, those are things that, it's just time consuming for an AE or a CSM. If they just had a call to do, and great, now they don't have to worry about it anymore. And then one of the other areas that I just think is so great is conversational AI. So you think about how a lot of times AEs spend time trying to explain what the product is doing, what service you're providing. But if you have an inbound prospect that's interested, and they can have a very short and meaningful conversation that seems very human-like, almost like there's a person behind it, and learn and kind of get assets and then talk to an AE when they're ready, that saves time and energy, right? And it increases the likelihood that they're going to ask you the right questions so you can identify the pain point that they truly have that your product can solve for. Then I would say the third area that's important is what they call descriptive AI. It's really about, taking unstructured data and finding visibility or insights through that unstructured data. So Gong is a classic example of that, right? You can't go through every single call recording you have, but it does a really great job of sentiment analysis and just kind of flagging different things within a call at scale, right? And so when you're thinking about, how do I know if our AEs are mentioning our new product? Well, set up a trigger in Gong and see if it's actually being discussed. So those are very low lift ways that you can incorporate AI into your day-to-day RevOps processes and tech stack so that you can actually raise your hand when exec is like, what are you doing for me today? Like, we've got AI covered. That is such an easy thing to start with now. Going back to what Jensen Wong said at the conference last week, there is a lot of hype. There is a hype cycle around AI, but it's not going away. It is a fundamental technology, a fundamental way of doing business that is going to change many different industries. And how great, from a RevOps perspective, would it be if you could kind of lead and control how that's used rather than being sort of told, oh my gosh, why are we not doing AI? And almost being sort of forced into being in that reactive mode. Whereas you can be very proactive, and a lot of the reps for these vendors are going to be so happy to talk to you and say, hey, here's some, suggestions. In fact, if you haven't had a QBR recently, or maybe, an executive review recently, schedule one. I'm always interested in learning about what's happening in the roadmap. Maybe you're hearing about other tools that are being used in the industry, but this is something where such a powerful lever, especially if RevOps can kind of say, hey, I have ownership of this and I can fundamentally change how our business works using this tool. So amazing. So I'm very much excited about AI, if you cannot tell.
Yeah, I think there is huge opportunity, and I think there is a lot of learning that needs to be done. That's one of the things that has impressed itself upon me. It's one thing to have AI, but it's another thing to know how to prompt it very well, to understand how to leverage the outputs, how to debug things if you're not getting the results that you want, none of which I claim to be expert in. But just speaking to people like yourself, it is a new skill. So to your point about, losing your job to the person who knows how to use AI, there's a real thing there, and it is something to keep in mind. Maybe we'll just end on, a slightly introspective note. You have a very mature team. It seems very high performing. You've told us about all the great things you do. It's interesting also to note that, we all have challenges, no matter where we are in our career. What are some of the things that you are finding difficult today, or that you just don't have totally figured out just yet?
Working in a startup environment, things shift so quickly.
They do.
And I guess a really big thing and then a sort of small big thing. The biggest thing is, how can you consistently support the changes that happen day to day, week over week, month over month as a startup, and keep your team feeling motivated and driven? Because sometimes it seems like there's a change in priority, but there isn't. It's just maybe the slight focus, but at the end of the day, the things that you need to accomplish are the same, but people get distracted by maybe the messaging or what's being said. But it's balancing sort of the chaos of being in a startup, the instability of doing new things, right? If you're a startup that's trying to make a difference in the world, you're doing something that other people have not been doing. And how do you balance that with stability for a team that needs some stability, some structure, some consistency in order to work effectively, right? Because when you think about operations, or you think about things like forecasting or reporting, you can't report if everything's constantly changing every second. And so by the nature of operations, by the nature of process, you need some stability. And so that is the biggest and hardest thing to manage or balance when you're in a startup environment. And I think the second piece for me is, how do you keep people inspired? Because a lot of times your day-to-day is not that sexy, right? It's troubleshooting. Why is Marketo not syncing with Salesforce? And I think as humans, as people, as much as we're like, yeah, we can do this day in, day out. We're curious. We want to learn. We want to grow. We want to have pride in what we're doing. And so the second hardest thing for me is, how do you create that environment where people feel like they're growing, even when they're running at 110%? Because all of that 110% is for the business, right? Because they're doing all these things to optimize revenue. And we may or may not see that. Some people get comped, maybe because they have a bonus structure that, benefits them when the company is doing well. Some people aren't, right? And so how do you make people feel like they're growing? How do you make them feel like, wait, here's a way that I can make my team better? I mean, I had a really great one-on-one with one of my analysts earlier today where she said, I know that we talked about me working on these projects and I'm working on them and here are my status updates. But, I was thinking about something you said where you said, it's really important for us to be in alignment and service our internal end users as much as our external end users. And I think one way I could do that would be to help clean up page layouts in Salesforce, which everyone in the world totally understands because it's always a nightmare. It's just like, but I think our sales ops manager is doing it. But the second thing I thought of is like, maybe I can make it easier for people to submit Jira tickets with us because I think we've gotten so many different form fields that now it's a little confusing. Amazing. And I think she had the bandwidth to think about that because we gave her space for growth. So one really important thing that I do for my team, and this is so important, I think, as a RevOps team, is that there is some kind of growth from a technology perspective, from a skill set perspective. We have a monthly certification accountability group that we do. It's just 30 minutes. Half the time we're like, yeah, we meant to get through modules X, Y, and Z, and we didn't because it was a crazy month. But I think making that space for people on your team so you can not just grow the business, but grow them as individuals so that they can take that knowledge and take that investment in them as a person and then bring that back because it does come back tenfold. I mean, I just gave you that example of, again, this analyst who was like, I want to make things better. And here's an example of how it can tangibly do that. But I think she was able to do that because we have been investing in her career growth. We've been investing in her ability to upskill, getting her exposed to different tools that she's never used before. And so it's really not just thinking about how can RevOps help the business, but you also have to feed yourself, right? So how do you feed your internal RevOps team so that they can be even more stronger, even more aligned with what's happening in the industry or technology-wise so that they can be very effective? And so that's the second thing that keeps me up at night. How do I keep my team interested, growing, without disrupting day-to-day operations?
I love it. So important. Julia, really glad you could join us today. It was super inspiring hearing about what you're doing, and lots of folks out there are going to find it interesting too. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.